All right, we've now been joined by Dr. Ricardo King, who is a public policy analyst. Thank you for coming on. Good morning.
Thank you very much for
Well,
having
listening
me.
through to all of this, yes, there are concerns as to how we ensure that this works. I mean, there will be plus or minus 5–10%, maybe areas that we may not be able to get it right. But from what you've seen of all of these policies and the intention, the comment of the president of Nigeria saying we have to make this work, how do you see this playing out?
Thank you very much. But you see, there are a number of concerns when you have to try to make this work because the strategies are on two different planes. There's going to be a strategy within Nigeria how to make it work, which will involve our manufacturing and how we can ramp up our own production and be able to produce the services needed. And then you're also going to have the issue of how to make this work within the African context. For example, you could say the low-hanging fruits will be something like complementary trade. If the presidents are able to negotiate complementary trade, then they are able to get their countries to work around it in terms of what African countries already demand from other continents, how they can reroute such demands within Africa. You could say that's complementary. But one of the biggest problems making this work is going to come back to trade routes, your trading routes. Because from time immemorial, the major thing that the Europeans did when they came in was to alter our trading routes. And so right now, even if you have Zimbabwe producing maybe a lot of maize, you might not have a direct route of getting that to maybe Cote d'Ivoire that wants it or Nigeria that wants it. So trying to sit again to see how you could recreate the trading routes within the continent. That's why I said there's going to be a strategy continent-wise to recreate these trading routes so that you can have normal transport routes or normal movements. And that will require investments, either investment in shipping, investments in rail lines. But that's a conversation that is going to happen with on the governmental level about how to recreate trading routes.
Because right now, it's even more difficult for one to fly probably from Lagos or Abuja to, say, Cote d'Ivoire, to Benin or something, without having to go through, divert yourself and then spend hours before you get to your neighbor. As I was saying, isn't it? Can't I just buy from the neighbor there? So you can even get to Europe faster than getting to one of these African countries.
Exactly. That's the alteration of the trading routes. So they have to look at how to tackle that trading route issue before you talk about the low-hanging fruit of complementary trade, about things we already produce that we could ramp up scale on. Then before we now talk about the nitty-gritty, about the real issues on the agreements in terms of the fears. Like if you look at, the president said something about incentives. You can't just give incentives without being very tactical on how those incentives will go. Look at what happened with the US in their NAFTA agreements. They had incentives, but you can't really, a company in Nigeria, if the incentive is better for him to be outside Nigeria, you will not be able to tell him to stop, to switch the African country that he's operating from. So all those things have to be factored in before you say you're going to make incentives.
So that means in some cases, sorry to jump in, it means that there will be cases where it will just have to wait maybe between 10 years before we can be competitive, because some of them will involve huge infrastructural development.
Some will involve, but that's why I say you have to target the low-hanging fruit. Maybe there is something that is needed very urgent, that the scale, the margin from that trade is worthwhile. You could now look at it whereby such trade, the trader is going to pay for itself.
For instance?
For instance now, if we look at Nigeria, we have petroleum. we could also start looking at how we could integrate the whole of West Africa into our supply line. Instead of talking about smuggling, we could look at why don't we integrate the whole of West Africa, and then look at how we supply everybody at once.
Okay, that raises a question of capacity. I mean, you talked about oil now. We know that rather than produce petroleum products in the country, we export the raw material and import the finished products. So it raises a question of capacity, not just of infrastructure, but of capacity. And the oil is just, petroleum is just one sector. But I don't know if we can say that that's a specialty that Africa has. Africa is largely agrarian. I don't know if that is, I mean, you would be able to speak to that more. Perhaps maybe it's just sub-Saharan Africa. So talking about capacity, beginning from capacity of African countries, the private sector in African countries, the public sector in African countries, how significantly do you see us needing to bridge capacity in order to be competitive, even within and among ourselves?
Yeah, that's why I told you that we need another strategy within the country in terms of being able to compete, because already we are talking about increases in electricity by next year. Oh. We are talking about increases in talking of removal of subsidy by June next year. So definitely that's going to increase your production costs. And you have to think about how Nigerian companies will be able to compete within the continent with these additional increases in energy. Because something we don't always realize is that when you talk of your factors of production, energy is not mentioned, but it's like giving. It is the most important factor of production. Your energy cost is baseline. Whatever it is will affect every other thing. So at times when we talk about removing subsidy and we talk about getting transportation and buses, we are missing the point. Your hairdresser cannot work without that little petrol. Your barber can't work. Everything runs on a baseline of energy. So whatever your energy cost is, that will determine whether you're even going to compete or not.
And when you say this appears that we gloss over it, when they teach you basic principles of factors of production in economics, land, labor, capital, and
yes.
You don't even talk about energy.
Yeah, because it's giving is the most important. In fact, the whole industrial revolution is based on that.
And now that they talk about us, taking away coal, which many of those economies developed their economies with, and some other economies are still grappling, crawling, trying to get to that level. And then, of course, the world will always move on. But in terms of coming up with that continent-wide, and not just continent-wide now, because even within the same continent, it has to be country-specific projects and policies that will ensure that your local industries benefit first.
Exactly, because even if you take, for right now, we need to also look at how to nurture our industries, because you can't compete with the global giants. If any of the global giants should move into an African country, yes, you say it's FDI, they will come in, they will set up shop, but definitely for a local company to be able to compete with them on that scale, they don't yet have, we don't really have the backbone.
Which raises again the question of capacity.
Exactly.
Of the Nigerian, of the African to do those things. So what are the things? I mean, I can't even begin to talk about low-hanging fruits right now because there is no land to even plant anything that's going to produce any low-hanging fruit. So in terms of must-do, I mean, Chamberlain is already scaling up to say 10 years before we begin to even maximize anything. In terms of must-do, what are the must-do within the next 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years?
You see, there's something in that agreement where they talk about competition. It's because this agreement is modeled after the EU one. And you find out that right now we still have the little gap whereby maybe CBN, you can help your different sectors, anchor borrowers plan, all those things. By the time that next phase of AfCFTA kicks in, you have like state aid rules, whereby you will not be able to even help the companies, except you're going to do it across board to anybody, even the foreign investor that comes in. So when we start talking about capacity, we have to be very deliberate about how we channel our demand in order to be able to use that demand to build up local companies.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so wind down, right?
A number of, and you may be aware of this, micro, small, and medium enterprises say, and of course you listen to the man DG say the same thing, that producing in country is very expensive. He said something, and I think I wrote it down. Ease of doing business without costs of doing business being reflected is useless.
Of course.
So how do we begin to mend those fences? Because if it is expensive to produce, it definitely is going to affect capacity to produce, capacity to ramp up productivity, and which will definitely affect our capacity to compete competitively.
Exactly. So that's why I told you the most important baseline is your energy. If we cannot look at a way where the government looks at us having, because you basically have two strategies. Either you are going to be the lowest cost producer, or you are going to produce for a niche. And when we are talking about ramping up production, that means you are trying to look at maximizing costs. And for you to have low costs, energy has to come down. Before you now talk about manpower costs in Africa generally is low, but your energy cost is going to be a major factor, whether you can compete with the rest of the world.
You know, there are just so many factors here, and the states have a huge role to play as well.
And then if I will add this thing, there might be a need to negotiate within the African countries about maybe like a standard rate, maybe for FDI in terms of tax rate. They may, just for fairness, because if you're maybe in Nigeria now, if we say corporate tax is 30%, and then maybe our neighbor in Chad says corporate tax is 2%, FDI is going to go there, and he will produce into your country. So there might be a need to have a baseline to say, okay, this might be a baseline among all of us for us to be in this whole thing together, so that nobody goes way and undercuts the other.
In the event that that fails, we have to have other layers. For instance, we know that, yes, we'll have the numbers, but it's not just going to be about the numbers, because we can't stop some of those countries, too, from taking advantage of their own strengths as well.
Of course.
So if they do that, and we feel we can say, okay, well, if any good is going to come, or services or products are going to come into this country, we can then say, as several people have suggested, well, a certain component of your products, if you have to bring them here, your raw materials or something have got to come from here. That way, but it's up to our chief negotiators and several other people to work out a policy that works for us, because there can be one size fits all kind of scenario. But it's always a going concern, something that I'll keep focusing on as we progress. We have to thank you for coming on, Dr. Ricardo King. So we will be back, and well, I didn't even talk about how do we make sure that politics is not our biggest industry. Maybe, who knows how that will be received. But just we'll toss to Abuja when we return.